It's now my pleasure to introduce biographer Robert Caro. Standing, as the Washington Post says, at the summit of American historical writing. Caro is the author of sweeping and groundbreaking biographies of New York power-brokering urban planner Robert Moses, as well as President Lyndon B. Johnson. The latter project, on the very complicated ex-president, began in 1976 and is still ongoing today, its fifth volume currently underway. What's amazing to me is that I have been reading Robert Caro for as long as he has been writing, which is now almost 50 years. Caro has earned an astounding 2 Pulitzer Prizes, 3 National Book Critics Circle Awards, 2 National Book Awards, and the Gold Medal in Biography from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. In 2010, President Obama awarded him the National Humanities Medal. Now Robert Caro turns his attention to a biographical subject a bit closer to home, himself. In his new book, Working, Researching, Interviewing, and Writing, he collects reminiscences, reflections, and lessons from a half-century of the writing life. Today he'll be in conversation with Dick Polman, writer-in-residence at the University of Pennsylvania, national political columnist at WHYY News, and contributor to The Atlantic. We're pleased to have them both here this afternoon. Please join me in welcoming Robert Caro and Dick Polman to the Free Library.
Thank you all for coming. This is great that we have such a big audience for noon, but I think that's testament to Mr. Caro's scholarship over the decades. And so I look forward to asking some questions, and we'll open it up later on for audience questions as well. So I'll just talk for a little bit. And I want to thank also, of course, the Free Library for having me here again and having Bob here. One of the things that I did when I read the proof of the memoir was to go back to the very first LBJ book, which I have on my shelf, which I got for my 31st birthday, with an inscription from my mother inside. And because I wanted to see the very first scene of the very first book and what you did with it. And it opens up with LBJ in 1940 at the Greenbrier Hotel in West Virginia. And he's on a blanket talking, I think, with one of his benefactors, Charles Marsh. Yes. And then I went to the footnotes immediately to see, well, how did this scene get put together? And there's something like 7 or 8 sources for this one scene with confirmation, I believe, from Lady Bird. But what struck me most about it in retrospect was how the total scene was painted. The weather, what the hotel looked like, what the grounds looked like, everything, all the texture around what was actually happening. And so many times in the memoir, you're talking about how you want the reader to see the material and to feel the material. My question about that is, because I think that's so important in narrative, did that come from, I mean, was that an instinctive goal that arose out of your journalistic training at Newsday? How much of it was that? How much of it perhaps was reading some of the so-called new journalists who use fiction techniques in nonfiction?
Right. Well, I always, it just came to me, I'm not sure it came from one place. Right at the beginning, when I started to write biographies, I just sort of felt the scene isn't complete unless you let the reader see where the scene is taking place. If you put the reader into the room that something is taking place, you often don't have to tell the reader something. He can feel it for himself. If you've painted Lyndon Johnson accurately enough, and you've painted the scene, we all know that when we go to a place, it has an influence on us. And if you do it, if you portray your character accurately enough and the place accurately enough, it could be like being there. That was what I felt.
One of the things I also noticed in the book was how you work so hard to get into a zone when you're working, and particularly on the writing end. And there's this great anecdote, which many of you will read, where you're at the library in New York, and you're in the middle of writing something, and you're so zoned in on it, and somebody comes and taps you on the shoulder, and you rise from the seat with almost your fist up, like you're going to just take that person out because they broke your concentration. And there's another place where, in the book, where you're talking about how when you try to sort of boil down what a book is about to a few paragraphs,
Yes.
and how difficult that is, and you say, you refer to yourself as a guy who in a very bad mood.
Yeah.
The question I have is how much fun do you get out of it? I mean, the work is so hard and so serious and so lengthy. How much fun do you get out of it?
Well, it depends. I'll say the guy who tapped me on the shoulder was this small, elderly, frail gentleman who was a good friend of mine. That was possibly my most embarrassing personal moment ever, as he cringed back before me. You know, you ask what's hard and it depends on the stage. I love doing research. I love doing interviewing, trying to get people to tell me what they know, and sometimes to tell me what they didn't realize they didn't know. I love that. I love researching things like a mile of Robert Moses's highways. I said I'm going to show what the human cost of highways really is. So I'm going to take 1 mile of the 627 miles of parkways and expressways that he's built. I'm going to show what the human cost is. What was there before? So what was there before was a thriving, mostly Jewish, but part Irish, part German neighborhood that was a real community to the people they were garment district people, pressers and cutters. They were sort of lower middle class. They didn't have a lot of money. But as long as they had this community that they lived in, they had a lot. They had neighbors. So when I felt I'm going to take that 1 mile and research it, first it started out as fun, intellectual curiosity. What was the neighborhood like before? You read the weekly newspapers from that era. You talk to people, about historians about what was there. Then it changes because you actually try to find the people who lived there and who were dispossessed. Now they're scattered all over the place. They live in Co-op City in a small apartment, or they live with their kids, or they live in a housing project. And over again, I remember, you heard in my notes on their interviews and what they were saying to me, there was one word I kept writing down because it was repeated by everybody, and the word was lonely. They didn't have their community. They didn't have their friends. In my view, lonely is a word no one ever says unless they are really lonely. It's a word you don't want to say about yourself. Then you say, this is what a highway is. So that gets very sad sometimes.
Right. Is it here's something, because I teach at Penn, so here's something I always tell the journalism students. Agree or disagree, or caveat this, if you will. I tell them that journalism is the most fun you can have working hard, and the hardest work you can do having fun. Does that get in your orbit there?
Yeah, my wife is always saying, you'd like to be a reporter again, wouldn't you? I said, boy, I'd like to have 1 year off to go back to being just a beat reporter. Yeah, I loved it.
As long as they don't make you take, early retirement or a buyout. They might make an exception for you. You mentioned the word notes. And one of the things I noticed a lot in the memoir is, you're referring often to your notes and to your note-taking. So you've never used any kind of a tape recorder at all?
Well, I wouldn't say never, because I tried using it for a period some years ago. I thought, I'm interviewing a lot of very smart people. Their guards are always up. You're trying to get them to tell the truth. You notice that their eyes never leave the tape recorder, So they always know it's on, and that, in a way, is a barrier to them. And now, when I finish a book, people come and interview me, and I have to tell you, I never forget the tape recorder.
They often say that the people who are the hardest to interview are other journalists, because they know how the gestalt of the whole thing. Of course, recorders are a lot smaller now and a lot more unobtrusive, and there is an argument that people are just used to seeing the phone on the table, and so it's not that big of a deal. And they're a lot less boxy than they were when you started working on LBJ.
Right.
But no.
Well, I still feel the same. I still feel the same way. You know, I take notes. I develop my own form of shorthand. A lot of reporters do that.
Yeah.
And I found out, but you're always worrying, you know, are you getting, let's say there are only a few quotes in an interview that you want to get every word, but you really want to get every word right. So I found out, just a digression, I was interviewing Lady Bird Johnson, and she recorded all the interviews. And she told me this one long story, which was really important to me. And what I do is, my rule is, I take notes in the stenographer's notebook, and my rule is that I always transcribe, I always type up that interview before I go to bed that night, no matter how late it is, because I want to still see in my mind the expressions on the person's face, etc. So she had it transcribed, and I compared it with my transcription, and every word was the same. So I felt good about that.
Did you, who'd you, in terms of working on either of the books, Robert Moses or LBJ, is there someone who stands out in your mind as the most challenging interviewee of all? The one you really took the most time to sort of penetrate and break through with?
Well, George Brown, you know, was a guy, it took me a long time, years. You know, there are a lot of these people. Well, probably I'll tell you an anecdote, but my anecdotes go on.
Well, we'll just say George Brown, the Texas oil.
Yeah, but I'll tell you about John
lobbyist.
Connally.
Okay.
So some of you remember John Connally. He was Nixon's Secretary of the Treasury, Secretary of the Navy, and wanted to run for president. And he was Johnson's closest aide when Johnson was first starting out. He went to Johnson right after the university. He graduated from the University of Texas. So while I was doing the first book, which took 7 years, I constantly could call his office, and the secretary would always take the message, but he would never call back. I wrote him letters. He never responded to the letters. Then when the book came out, he and a lot of other Johnson people really attacked it. I didn't care about anybody else's attacks, but I worried about Connally because I thought he really was there more than, was I wrong about some things? Then a couple of years later, as I'm working on the second volume, we had a mutual friend. Her name was Margaret Moyers. She was the first woman to be bureau chief of a major newspaper, the Dallas Times-Herald. And she calls me up out of nowhere. She says, Bob, I was at a dinner party last night, and the governor was there. In Texas, they all still call John Connally the governor. And he was talking about your book. He's reading it, Bob, and he really likes it. So I resisted the temptation to say I wish he had read it before he attacked me. And I'm glad I resisted doing that. A couple of weeks later, she says, you know, I was at another dinner party. He came in, Bob. He was holding your book. He's finishing it. He really likes it. I said, great. You know, then out of nowhere, the phone rings in my office one day, and boy says, Mr. Caro, they will pronounce it Caro in Texas. And Mr. Caro, this is John Connally. I said, oh, hello, Governor. You know, he says, I just finished your book, and he says something very nice about it. Then he says, but one thing really bothers me. He said, you wrote this without ever trying to talk to me. So he said, said, you know, I'd really love to talk to you about Lyndon Johnson. And he said, as if it required some incentive for me to talk to him, you know, the only place I can get a chance to really talk uninterrupted is down at my ranch. So if you'll come down to my ranch for 3 or 4 days, I promise you there's no question I won't answer. So I did that, and it was just like a lesson in politics. You know, sometimes you think you know about politics. When you listen to someone like John Connally talk, you realize you can learn something new every 5 minutes that you never thought of. We would go out. He then had this huge ranch. He had a stable of quarter horses. And he'd wake me up. I was in the guest house at like 6 o'clock in the morning, and he'd go and sit on the top rail of the fence as his vaqueros, Mexican vaqueros, were exercising the quarter horses, or sometimes they'd bring out lawn chairs. So in 4 days, but in fact, there was one question and only one question that he wouldn't answer. He wouldn't answer when I said, well, what would Lyndon Johnson say about Bobby Kennedy when you were alone?
Well, that's interesting. I mean, there's been whole books written about that, about his attitude toward him.
Yeah.
Mutual, you know.
Yes.
Now, is there anybody in all those years who you never that you were never able to get to, and who stonewalled you all the way to the bitter end for either of those books that you wish, looking back, that you were able to get?
Well, Bill Moyers, every Johnson person has talked to me. Now, I think, with one exception, Bill Moyers. He won't talk to me.
What do you attribute that to? Is it got PBS?
I don't know. It's not that he doesn't like the books, because he said very complimentary things about him in public. You know, I don't know why.
Yeah, maybe he was saving it for his own books rather than giving them to you. That happens. That happens. You mentioned a second ago about that Connally, I think, was that people have attacked the books. You know, that which happens. One of the things this occurred to me just a few weeks ago. First time ever, I was at the library in Austin, and it occurred to me then, and some people here might have this question in their minds, is that you wrote multiple books about Johnson. You've written multiple books about Johnson. If you go even to the first one, it's not exactly, you know, unflattering. It's nuanced, and so it's the good and the bad and the complex. And yet you still were going back to the library year after year, decade after decade. So, and we were talking about this backstage, that there were some different stages about how the library treated you and how they viewed you,
yes,
and how they were hostile at first and then got nicer later on.
Yes.
Can you just run through that chronology a little bit? Because I think people might be wondering, well, why did they continue to welcome you with open arms, as it were?
Well, they certainly didn't welcome me with open arms
At the
while I
beginning,
was working on the first or second books. As I was telling you backstage, they had a director who was very emotionally and psychologically attached to Lyndon Johnson, and he really hated my books, I know. And they can make things hard for you and unpleasant for you when you have to work there a lot. But then they got a new director, and of course, they never would invite me to speak there. I told that before, that I think I was the only historian in the Western world who wasn't invited to speak at the Lyndon Johnson Library. So they got a new director, Betty Sue Flowers was her name, a professor of English literature, and she said, well, my first priority is to invite Robert Caro to speak here. And then she said, which was more important to me, and my second priority is to open whatever papers he wants open. So now they're perfectly helpful, and have been for like 15 years or so.
So, and what is, just generally speaking, I mean, journalists have to have thick skins or develop thick skins. What has been your just attitude over the years about when you get backlash to some of the books? Like, for instance, the best example I could think of was after the second Means of Ascent. That's the second book. All right. So when the second book came out, and you were talking in that book a lot about his stolen Senate election of 1948. Stealing it from Coke Stevenson, who was the other candidate.
Yeah.
So I know there were some reviewers who said that they thought that you had sort of pumped up the image of Coke Stevenson being this glorified guy in order to sort of, this is their argument, not mine, in order to kind of like talk about this theft and how awful it was. Is it just a question of, do you shrug that stuff off as just kind of like, this is collateral damage of just what happens when you put yourself out there, or do you want to come back at it?
That's a very good question. So Coke Stevenson, I did paint in heroic terms, but the reason was when I was down in Texas, he was still this legendary figure in Texas. He was the most popular governor that the state had ever had. Until the stolen election, he never lost an election. He once, running for governor, carried all 254 counties in Texas, liberal, conservative. But he was the image to Texans of the heroic Texan, because he started out as a 14-year-old boy on a ranch. He created, while he was still 14 and 15, a freight line where he would drive these mules for hundreds of miles across Texas by himself, carrying supplies and goods. He built this great ranch out of this legendary ranch out in the hill country. And when he was governor, he was just known as incorruptible. He was like Mr. Texas. So I wanted to show, in that campaign, Lyndon Johnson discovers negative advertising. Think how long ago this is. It's 1948. And he realizes that what he has to do is destroy this image, or he's not going to win. So he uses all these really pioneers in a lot of ways, these negative advertising tactics, and succeeds in coming close. Doesn't come close enough. So he steals the rest of the votes. And I said, you know, I'm sorry, I'm answering this in a long way. You, Bob, Caro, the books are called, as you know, The Years of Lyndon Johnson. The reason they're called that is that I didn't try to just set out to tell the story of Lyndon Johnson. I wanted to show how political power works in the United States during this whole span, 50 or 60 years. When you look at it, you say, stolen elections are not a small part of it. There are a lot of stolen elections in American history that were important. And you say, so I'm going to take one stolen election, and I'm going to show what a stolen election is and the consequences it can have and how it's done. That was why I concentrated on that election so much.
But when you read the criticism, do you just kind of like shrug it off and go about your work?
No. No, I go about my work. I didn't say I shrugged it off.
That's what I wanted to hear. That's why. Ask the follow-up question and I get the answer. Thank you. All right, so here's, talking about power, one of the things that, and you mentioned this in the memoir, is, and I remember this from the books, is about how George Brown and Root, which was this big oil company in Texas, who he had such a close alliance with.
Yes.
And they helped him accrue political power because they gave him all this money that he then dispersed to candidates in the House.
Correct.
1940 or thereabouts. Okay.
Correct.
So, and there's so much and you talk about that a lot. About that was a real lesson in how power works and how this guy who had just been in Congress for a few years got all this power. I was just wondering, all right, so you went through all the documentation at the library, and you were able to piece all that together as you described. Some of the stuff is not particularly flattering to LBJ, and even if, considering the fact that he had a secret side to him, how come he saved all this stuff? That always amazed me that he saved everything, even the stuff that was not flattering.
No, I would disagree with you. He didn't save stuff. But what I found was, see, I was told when someone said, how did he get power so fast in the House? He's 29 years old. 3 years later, he suddenly has, you can see, he has all this power. You say, how did he get it, So I was told by a man named, I don't think anyone here is old enough to remember him, Tommy the Cork Corcoran. He was the ultimate Washington fixer. He and I became great friends. And he used to call me kid. And so I said, what happened in October? It all happens in 1 month. Before he comes to Congress in 1937, up till October 1940, you look at all his correspondence, I'm reading all this stuff, he's asking senior congressmen or committee chairmen, can I have 5 minutes of your time? It's that tone. Then all of a sudden, after November 5th, 1940, Election Day, they're writing him, Lyndon, can I have 5 minutes of your time? So I asked Corcoran, what happened in October 1940? He said, money, kid, money. But he said, you're never going to be able to write about it, kid. I said, why not? He said, because Lyndon never wrote anything down. And I believed that. I mean, I had spent, by that time, a couple of years going through his papers, and I never found anything, So, but I remembered this when I was a young reporter, I was told, turn every page. So I said, well, I can't turn every page in the Johnson Library. There's 45 million documents, but I'll turn every page in 1940, and that was like 6 or 7 boxes of stuff. I'm going through them, and it's one letter that doesn't mean anything after another. You know, you're just sitting there saying to yourself, Bob, you're just wasting another 3 years, 3 months of your life. And then all of a sudden, he did write something down. There was a telegram from George Brown on October 13th, 1940, and it says, Lyndon, the checks are on the way. And cross-referencing that to the names of the 6 guys, that you can see that all this money is coming up from Texas. And I keep looking through there, and there's another folder. The title is something like General Unarranged, right? And in the middle of nothing, there is a list, and I mean, you're a great reporter. To me, this was the most amazing thing. So both John Connally and Johnson's other chief assistant, Walter Jenkins, they each said they typed the list. But whoever typed it, this is what it was. It was like 6 sheets of typed paper. On each sheet, there are 2 typed columns. In the left-hand column is the name of a congressman. In the middle in a typed column is first the congressman's district, then how much money does he want? The amounts are so small. I mean, they're hundreds of dollars. You know, I need $450 for last-minute advertising. I need $600 trying to cheat us at the polls. I need $600 for poll watching. But in the left-hand margin are notations by each name in Lyndon Johnson's handwriting. If he was going to give the guy all the money he asked for, he wrote okay. If he was going to give him part of that money, he wrote okay and the amount he was giving. Okay, 300, okay, 500. But by some names, he wrote none. And by some names, he wrote none out. So I asked John Connally, what did none out mean? And Connally said to me, I still remember his tone of voice, he was never going to get anything from Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson never forgot, and he never forgave. So by the end of that election, they knew if they wanted this huge Texas oil money, contracting money, they had to go through this young congressman. That was how he started to rise to national power.
All right, so here's a question. This maybe is a slightly more personal nature. We all know you're still a sprightly young man. But in terms of all this research and reporting and writing, have you in recent years made any accommodations and adjustments to whatever stamina you have, which I assume is probably a tad less than it was 40 years ago?
No.
I could swear it said in your book that you don't write at night as much anymore, or you leave the office earlier.
That's right. I don't work as late. You're right. Excuse me. I don't work as late in the day as I used to, because I found. But this goes back decades, really. I found that what I write in the late afternoon at the end of a long day, I start each day by reading what I wrote the day before. And I started to realize, it wasn't really so much a question of, I guess stamina played a role in it or something, but whatever I wrote at the end of the day, I was just having to throw out because it wasn't as good. So I stopped earlier.
Mm-hmm. So, and what time do you typically start now on your routine?
Well, it's not a set time. You know, let's say I set the alarm for 7:30. But as you get into a chapter and you get wound up and excited by it, you get up earlier and earlier because you can't wait to get to work. So Ina said to me, she says, do you know what time it is? You know, and I say, I don't want to know.
And you've never felt the need to sort of work off, it's much easier to write on a computer, I mean, you can delete and then write over it, But right on the cover of the book, you guys might have all seen already, is that, there's a Smith Corona typewriter, which, I have a soft spot for that kind of stuff, too, when I started out. But it's much easier to write on a computer and rewrite and all that stuff. So, but you've never been tempted by the technology to make it your friend?
Oh, well, I have been tempted, but I don't want it to be too easy. I want it to be slower, so that when you do things slower, you think more with it. It's like, that's why I write in longhand, because it's the slowest method of committing your thoughts to paper. My first drafts are in longhand, then I go to the typewriter. I don't want to be too fast, because I found, well, there was a reason. When I was at Princeton and I was in creative writing courses, you had to hand in a short story every 2 weeks. So I was always doing it after midnight, the last night, an all-nighter, When I became a newspaper man, I was really a fast rewrite man, And when I stopped, but I realized I wasn't thinking things through, because this creative writing teacher at Princeton, who was a great critic, now forgotten, his name is R.P. Blackmer, I thought I had fooled him. I took his course for 2 years, and he always gave me good grades, and he always said nice things about my short stories. Then my last session with him, the last short story I wrote with him, he handed it back, and he said something complimentary about it. And then he said, words I will never forget, "But Mr. Caro, you will never achieve what you want to achieve unless you stop thinking with your fingers." And I knew, I say in the book, did you ever know when someone is seeing right through you? And I knew he had seen right through me all along. He knew I wasn't really thinking about these stories. It was too easy just to write them. So when I quit to do a book, I said, I really want to explain Robert Moses' political power, and it's hard. I'm going to make myself slow down and think things all the way through. It's not a good reason that I don't use a computer. It's sort of out of desperation.
Well,
I just don't want to be fast.
A couple more from me, and then we're going to go to the audience. All right, so thinking with your fingers seems to be, in the speeded up world that we have today, in media in particular, that's what everybody seems to be doing. They're thinking with their fingers, if they're even thinking at all. They're tweeting with their fingers, which may not even be thinking. I'm just concerned, how much of that, and I tweet too, so how much of that, are you concerned about the kineticism of today's media world? It seems like so completely antithetical to what you believe to be valuable. Power is complicated, and here's everybody on Twitter just, going right at, somebody had a vote 15 or 20 years ago, boom, that person is completely unacceptable. Does any of this bother you culturally? Journalistically, I should say.
I think, some of the reporting is great today. I was just talking, a lot of the revelations about President Trump's White House, they all turn out to be true. Well, they don't all, but a very high percentage of them turn out to be accurate. So the reporting is really great. I admire it. For me, everything, it's never, I'm not giving any advice. That's, for me, I felt I had to make myself slow down.
Mm-hmm. So my last question, then we're going to go to the audience. Do you regret that you won't have a book or two in you about Donald Trump? Talking about the exercise of power, if exercise is the right word.
Yeah, I do.
One of the most disturbing things to me in a rather checkered career of LBJ was how badly he was treated by the Kennedys. Did you talk to him about that? Was he open about how he felt? Because I thought he was very badly treated in that period.
Yes. Can you all hear that question? Yeah. Johnson and the Kennedys is you used the word disturbing. As I was finding out, it was very disturbing to me. When Johnson is vice president, the Kennedys, President Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy, won't even ask him for advice on legislation. When their civil rights bill is stalled, he tries to tell, they won't, he begs for, as I recall in the book, for 15 minutes alone with the president, and he doesn't get it. So you say, here's this genius, legislator. The Kennedys don't make use of him. They humiliate him at Bobby Kennedy's parties, which were legendary. Everyone wanted to go to Bobby Kennedy's parties. He usually wasn't invited. If he was invited, he was put at what Ethel Kennedy called the loser's table. And he knew it was the loser's table. A very, very upsetting, humiliating time.
Right here, and then we'll move backwards.
Mr. Caro, if I could, I'd like to ask you a virtual historical question. Can you take the Master of the Senate and put him in the Senate today and speculate on how he would deal with the likes of Mitch McConnell if he were either in the majority or the minority? Thank you.
That's a good question. I would say first, I have no idea how he would do it. But the fact is, when he became majority leader of the Senate in January 1955, and he was for 6 years until January 61 when he left to become vice president. So after the days of Webster, Clay, and Calhoun, which was in the 1850s, the Senate was really, if you look at it in American history, the same dysfunctional mess it is today. The leader before Lyndon Johnson, Alvin Barkley of Kentucky, said nobody can lead the Senate. A leader has nothing to give them, nothing to threaten them with. Johnson becomes majority leader in January 55. He instantly finds ways of getting real power in the Senate. The Senate works. For 6 years, it is the center of governmental ingenuity and creativity in Washington. I mean, it's not Eisenhower's civil rights bill, it's Lyndon Johnson's civil rights bill. He leaves to become vice president. In 1 month, Washington columnists are writing that it's the same dysfunctional mess as it was before. So do I believe Johnson would find a way? I do. Do I know what the way is? I don't.
So how have your views on society changed as a result of your work?
How has society changed?
How have your views on society changed as a result of your work?
Oh, that's another good question. But my views on what government, in my books, one of the things that is the immense power of government on our lives, both for good and for not good. I mean, you really say, the young Congressman Lyndon Johnson, those of you who read the first volume, bringing electricity to the hill country and transforming the lives of these people who were really living as if they were in the Middle Ages. I mean, it seemed impossible. He runs for Congress. They don't have electricity, so the women have to haul up every bucket of water by hand, 200 gallons a day a farm family used then. And all had to be hauled up by the woman because they were so poor. The husband had to be in the fields working, plowing, or if they were raising the cattle. And as soon as the kids would get old enough to work in the fields, they had to work there too. So she was alone in the house all day. All these chores had to be done by hand. He runs for Congress. He says, I'll bring electricity here. So the women of the hill country are all bent and stooped. When I said these old women, they're more stooped. Bent is the hill country word for stooped. They're all bent more than city people are. And he runs for Congress. He says, I'll bring electricity, and then you won't run. He says, you won't look like your mother looks. And that line works. He's elected to Congress, and he brings electricity. He transforms the country. The Civil Rights Act, I'm not sure we'd have the Civil Rights Act today or the Voting Rights Act if Lyndon Johnson hadn't been president then. On the other hand, all the men who were shipped off to Vietnam, that's political power too. So my views have changed. I've become more and more appreciative of the extent to which government can change our lives, or the effect that government has on our lives.
In your book, you very dramatically and put us in with the events of November 22nd, 1963, both in Dallas and in Washington, where there was an investigation of Johnson's finances. And I'm wondering what you think would have come had President Kennedy not been assassinated? Would that investigation have led to anything, and would Johnson have been on the ticket in 1964?
Well, I say in the book, I don't know the answer to that question. No one can really know the answer to that question. What you said is a fact. At the moment that President Kennedy goes to Dallas, there are two investigations going on in Washington. One which was about to contain some terribly, incriminating evidence about Lyndon Johnson. That very morning, the key witness in that investigation, without trying to recap the whole thing, is about to give the Senate Rules Committee the checks made out to Lyndon Johnson for a favor, a quid pro quo, a favor, and a lot of other. And so you say this would, whether he'd still be on the ticket or not, no one can really answer that. Certainly, there's a lot of reasons to think he would not have been on the ticket.
Is there an historian, ancient or modern, whose work you most admire, perhaps consider a role model, and why?
What was that thing?
Is there someone like an ancient historian, you were
Oh.
saying? Or other ancient or modern
Oh,
historian
ancient or
who you
modern.
admire?
Yeah. Well, yes. The historian, who writes best and a lot better than me is Gibbon. You say, why does the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, which was written now almost more than 300 years ago, why does that endure? Why is it still taught? Just try reading it. I mean, the sentences are so great. I every so once in a while, I say, I pull it out. I just open it at random to see what a really great writer can do. So he's quite wonderful to me.
Yes, down front here, and then we'll come back to you guys.
Two questions. One is, sure. When Johnson withdrew in '68, Kennedy was still alive, and I'd ask you to just comment on what today you feel was really driving Johnson's decision at that time. And my second question is, when I read the previous volume, or the last one, I was struck by the differences, but also the similarities of the political alignments in the country. Different parties, perhaps, but similar political alignments to today. It just didn't seem that different, which was contrary to my assumption. I wonder if you could comment on that and whether you feel that's the case or not.
Why I think the relationship to Congress being so split, people forget
Or the
that.
political affiliations and
Yes,
and
well,
relationships.
That's right. The Congress was split, but as you say, it wasn't by political affiliations. Today you could say it's the Democrats against the Republicans or irreconcilable enemies. Then in Congress and the Senate, you had irreconcilable enemies. You had on the one side the liberals, so that was most of the Democrats, but you also had the liberal Republicans from the Northeast with them. So you had both Democrats and Republicans on the side of, let's say, civil rights and social welfare legislation. On the other side, you had the Midwestern Republicans who were these dyed-in-the-wool conservatives, and you also had, more importantly, the Southern Democrats. The Southern Democrats, these were guys who had been in Congress for 36 years, 30 years. I forget the year, the right numbers for any particular year, but in a typical year, there were 16 great standing committees of the Senate, and the Southerners chaired 11 of them, So you say, how did anybody get anything through? Well, Lyndon Johnson got stuff through. To me, that's political genius.
In your work, you comment on two individuals that played a critical role in Lyndon Johnson's career and his life, Sam Rayburn and Richard Russell. And in keeping with your last answer, maybe you could talk a little bit about his relationship with both of those key congressional figures.
What was the last part of that question?
If you can talk about LBJ's, just a little bit about LBJ's relationship with
Both
Russell and Rayburn.
Well, with both of them, they were both bachelors. They were both lonely, very lonely men. With both of them, he played what people who watching him in action said he played the professional son. They were both lonely men. He would invite them to his house for dinner, for Sunday brunch. Lady Bird was very charming with them. She had, I think, a very good heart. They felt at home there. They played with his two daughters. And Johnson was always making them believe that he believed the way they believed. You know, Richard Russell, who was the most avowed, he was the leader of the Southern Bloc, a man, a terrible segregationist, just hated black people with a visceral hatred. Lyndon Johnson made him believe for 20 years that he believed the same way that Russell did. And then he becomes president, and he says, our first priority is to pass the Civil Rights Bill.
Yellow, the yellow blouse, right here.
The yellow one.
Well, given the fact that today, the House and Senate, is so many more, women and minorities and so on, and it could a man like Lyndon Johnson even get elected today, let alone be able to do all he did to lead the Senate?
Well, yeah, what I think is, it's a very good question, but what I think is, that's what political genius is. So every so often, somebody comes along who can do what no one else can do. Like you take Robert Moses, we believe that power in a democracy comes from being elected, right? Here, Robert Moses was never elected to anything, but he had more power than anyone who was elected, more power than any mayor of New York or governor of New York, more power than any mayor and governor combined. And he held this power, just think, for 44 years, and with it, he shaped the city. Every highway you drive in and around New York is built by one man. Every bridge, every modern bridge. So you say he did something no one else could do. So if you figure out how he did it, you're learning something about political power. Johnson, as I said answering this gentleman, he did something no one else did. He made the Senate work. He's the only one who did. So the nature of political genius, in my view, is they'll find a way. Every so often, someone comes along who will find a way to do what no one else can do. Do I believe he would find a way today? Yeah, I just don't know it. I don't have no idea what it is.
We're told that the Obama library is going to be all digital. Wonder what you think about that.
Well, I don't know the details of it, so I'm speaking out of ignorance. Just off the top of my head, I don't like the idea because somebody has to decide what is digitized and the form in which it's digitized. I don't want anybody standing between me and the original papers, documents, or emails. So that's my own. But as I say, I don't know how they're going to do it. Yes,
Lyndon Johnson, I want to bring up the elephant in the room, Vietnam. I know I'm anticipating your next volume, but recently, a few years ago, his family was arguing that insufficient attention was paid to his war on poverty and the great civil movement to improve the lives of many, many downtrodden blacks and minorities in the country. And all of that's been kind of lost in the shadow of Vietnam. Where is the balance between the good and, as I would arguably say, the bad?
Well, that's another great question. I'm sort of wrestling with that now. That's what this last book is basically about. Because when he's president, on the one hand, he passes Head Start, Medicare, Medicaid, all the war on poverty bills, 70 different education bills for school construction, for loans, that's on the one side. On the other side, he sends 600,000, almost 600,000 men. Just think of that. Sends 600,000 men to fight in the jungles of Asia. And he drops more bombs on Vietnam than we dropped on Germany. And the total number, I have to say, I'm not satisfied that I have it yet. I'm trying to put together people killed, South Vietnamese soldiers. We had 58,000 killed. But if you add in the South Vietnamese soldiers and civilians, the North Vietnamese people bombed in cities, it's well over 2 million. And so you think this is a major war. And as you just said, at the time, it overshadowed everything else, and he didn't run for president in 1968. So that's actually the question I'm asking myself all the time.
Because we just.
You were doing so good.
I was going to say, well, first of all, I think we're just about out of time. I'm so sorry we didn't get to everybody's question. We probably could have done double the time, obviously. But I was going to make just two quick closing comments. One was, and picking up on what you just said, if you don't do it within everybody's expected time frame here, HBO is going to do what they did with George Martin, and they're going to hire a couple people to finish it for you. But one of the things in the book that really stood out to me was when you're working on Robert Moses, and you found out that there were documents that nobody had seen, which were in, what was it, the boat basin yard or something like that, right? And you had to go down a couple flights into this dank place, and there were some files. And the people who worked there knew that you were doing something about Robert Moses that they weren't sure they liked. And so when you went out, when you and your spouse went out to lunch, they would loosen the light bulbs, so sometimes you come back in
They
and
would
it was
take them
dimmer,
away.
or they'd take them out.
Yeah.
Right? So what Bob did every day was he would bring in his attaché case the next day, he would bring in fresh light bulbs so that he could put them in. And I think that's a wonderful metaphor for journalism and transparency and for all of us. So thank you so much.
Thank you.